All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a great crowd already. And I do apologize for getting a little bit of a late start, but I'm glad that you are here. This is Left Bank Books Presents Online, Paola Ramos, in conversation with Brittany Packnett Cunningham, and they will be discussing Paola's new book, Finding Latinx. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We are celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Pao, Brittany, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books. We have curbside pickup, delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. And we just added in shopping by appointments as well. So if you have been really anxious to get back in the store and to see what beautiful books we have on our shelves, you can now do that on our website. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We have done over 90 events virtually at this point. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for any of your friends at left-bank.com. And purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books, I will note that it is signed as well. That allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. We thank you for your support. We need your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. I cannot thank them enough. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. And you can do that at any point in time during the event. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Tonight's event. Young Latinos across the United States are redefining their identities, pushing boundaries and awakening politically in powerful and surprising ways. Many of them Afro-Latino, Indigenous, Muslim, queer, and undocumented, living in large cities and small towns, are voices who have been chronically overlooked in how the diverse population of almost 60 million Latinos in the US have been represented. No longer. In this empowering cross-country travelogue, journalist and activist Paola Ramos embarks on a journey to find the communities of people defining the controversial term Latinx. She introduces us to the indigenous, what's that? I cannot pronounce this word, I'm so sorry. Who rebuilt the main street in a post-industrial town in upstate New York, the Los Poderosos, who fight for reproductive rights in Texas, the musicians in Milwaukee whose beats reassure others of their belonging, as well as drag queens here in St. Louis, environmental activists, farm workers, and the migrants detained at our border. Drawing on intensive field research as well as her own personal story, Ramos chronicles how Latinx has given rise to a sense of collectivity and solidarity among Latinos unseen in this country for decades. A vital and inspiring work of reportage, Finding Latinx calls on all of us to expand our understanding of what it means to be Latino and what it means to be American. The first step towards change, writes Ramos, is for us to recognize who we are. Stacey Abrams, the great Stacey Abrams, says, Ramos compels us to reconsider our understanding of what it means to belong. Finding Latinx guides readers into a deeper understanding of who we are at our core and on the margins, nuanced identities that compose the great American mosaic. Paola Ramos is a host and correspondent for Vice and Vice News, as well as a contributor to Telemundo News and MSNBC. Ramos was the Deputy Director of Hispanic Media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and a political appointee during the Barack Obama administration. And she also served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. She's a former fellow at Emerson Collective. Ramos received her MA in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School and her BA from Barnard College, Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn. And tonight, Paola will be in conversation with Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who is a leader at the intersection of culture and justice. She is an NBC News and MSNBC contributor, 2020 fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics, and host of Undistracted, a news and justice podcast with an intersectional lens on the world. A lifelong activist and proud member of the Ferguson Uprising, Brittany was host of the 2019 iHeartRadio Best Political Podcast, Pod Save the People, for 3 years. Brittany is the founder and principal of Love and Power Works, a full-service social impact firm focusing on creating justice and equity in every sector. In the past, Brittany held top roles at Teach for America, and I believe that we have a lot of people watching from Teach for America, so hello, and was a congressional policy advisor and co-founded Campaign Zero. And now, without further ado, I am very happy and proud to be able to announce Paola Ramos in conversation with Brittany Cunningham. If you would help me in welcoming them. Hello, everyone. A big round of applause from everyone at home.
Hi.
Hey, thanks so much for having us. Oh my gosh, Pal, I'm so excited to be having this conversation. When the book came in the mail, I could not open it fast enough. This book is fascinating. It's so incredibly accessible and readable. I'm so excited to talk about it. I want to make 3 appeals before we dive in. The first one is couched in gratitude to Left Bank Books for stepping up. They were always involved with this conversation, but they stepped up at the last minute to be the sponsoring producer of this event and to actually host it when Pao and I were notified by some circumstances in my hometown of St. Louis, in many of your hometown of St. Louis, surrounding the public library system. So we are really, really grateful to the folks who are leading the movement at Libraries for All in St. Louis. I am a lover of the St. Louis public library system, and I fully believe that they can and will make the changes necessary to make sure that the library is a place that is welcoming and inclusive of all folks. The folks at Libraries for All in St. Louis want to make sure that libraries are divested from partnerships with police and are rehiring the many incredible staff members that were recently let go before they finalize their 2021 budget. So if you want to support that movement, you can follow at LIB, the number 4, all STL on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We are deeply grateful that they reached out, and we're grateful to Left Bank for stepping in, which brings me to appeal number 2. Continue to support Left Bank Books. Shane talked about it already. I grew up in St. Louis, as you all know, and I went to elementary school right around the corner from the Left Bank location on Euclid, which means that my favorite thing to do after school was to go to Left Bank. Whenever one of my parents said, we're going to go to the bookstore, I mean, it was just like, birds started flying, like God started singing. I was just so excited. Left Bank was always a place that I knew I could find the writers that were not being carried on other bookshelves, the subjects that were not being carried on other bookshelves. And most importantly, I knew Left Bank was going to be a business that stood up for my community, and they've continued to do that. And so it's now it's time for us to stand up for Left Bank. So that brings me to my third appeal. You need to be buying Finding Latinx, and you need to be doing it at left-bank.com. So with that, let's get right into it. Because there's so much I want to ask you about, but let's begin at the beginning. You decided to call this Finding Latinx, knowing that word is controversial. For those of us who are not native Spanish speakers, did not grow up speaking Spanish, my mom made me take Latin for 6 years. Good God. I love her for it, but I never went to law school, so it didn't.
Have you ever used it?
Right, I've used it like once or twice. But for those of us who don't understand the controversy, explain to us why the changing of the end of this word matters so much.
Right. So the Spanish language itself is gendered, it's Latino, Latina. And so the first time you start seeing the word Latinx pop up is online in the early 2000s, around like 2004. And it's queer Latinos who start using the X, who start integrating that in the vocabulary to break gender norms and stereotypes. The controversy, though, is that it didn't end with that. So if Latinx was simply a word to define queer folks and to define trans folks, then I feel like people wouldn't have a problem with it. The story is that suddenly you start seeing more Latinos use the word, right, without really knowing what it meant. But I think most people that use it, which I have to say, it's not a lot of people, and that's why I wrote the book. Most people will tell you that it simply feels right and it feels better and it feels more like what we're supposed to be. No, suddenly you have Afro-Latinos using it, you have some indigenous folks using it, and you have trans folks and queer folks. And so it's, to me, the way that I see it is simply the evolution of our community. You know, it is an invitation for anybody that has ever felt left out of the Latino community. It's 60 million of us, and we've never had this conversation. No, we've never understood, like, who are we? No.
Yeah, I hear that, and I'm excited about it because and we'll get to this in a second, but for a lot of folks like me who grew up in the Midwest, this is an evolution that we may or may not be as familiar with. So what inspired you to actually sit down and say, this is the book that I need to write right now for this moment?
So it's exactly literally 4 years ago. No, so I'm working in the Clinton campaign. My job there was I was one of the people in charge of Hispanic press. And so I remember we were all completely convinced that, Latinos would be sort of in the headlines the morning after the election, right? And that the headlines would say that Latinos were the ones responsible for ensuring that Donald Trump didn't make it into the White House. We were all convinced. I was convinced. And so the story then, we know less than 50% of eligible Latino voters actually turned out. And I remember having a moment literally 4 years ago, and I was like, this is my career, and I don't even know who the hell I'm talking about. No, like, who are those 50% that we didn't see? And when we were going to these battleground states, who were we not talking to, and who were we not looking at? And I just had to look at myself. No, how had I changed from my parents' generation? No, what did I do with all of the rights that they gave to me? No, how am I flowing with all of these different identities? And how is that reflected in the country? And so that was it, right? It was understanding kind of the mistakes that we made in 2016. And just looking at the country through a different lens.
And this is so fascinating because there are a lot of books and articles and podcasts about what we call the Latino vote, right? And we treat it like this monolithic voting block, which it, of course, is not. But for those who pick up and buy Finding Latinx, what are they going to find in these pages that is a different conversation about the Latinx vote that we wouldn't find anywhere else?
It is real stories. No, it is not when they think of us and they think of us in numbers. No, that is the power that is given to us. No, they tell you that it's 60 million, that is 32 million strong, and they'll tell you that our consumer power is insane, right? It's in the trillions. So they look at us in numbers and stats, and that's what the polls show you. So what this book is, it doesn't care about the numbers. No, I go in and I talk to real people, and I ask questions that I never asked, that people never asked me, and that's what it is, right? It's simply, it's not guided by numbers. Some people will say, okay, but how do you quantify your book? And I've been criticized by that, but like, really, who are Latinx, and like how many trans people are there really? Why do you care about them? I don't care about that. No, these are the voices that exist, and so that I hope that makes a difference.
I want to ask you, I want to keep double clicking on this conversation about politics, because we are 24 hours post what I guess we can call a debate. I don't exactly know what it was. The moderator did an incredible job.
Amazing.
A very, very difficult task. But we heard a lot about how this current administration feels about the Latinx community. How are you feeling after listening to that? Or did you even watch, or were you like,
No, I did. No, I did. I always say I'm not going to, and then I'm like, okay, fine.
You're like,
I think there was one really important thing that Joe Biden did, which was an apology. It was an apology something that he had said before in local stations, but he had never done it on a debate stage, right? Which is that he acknowledged the pain that the Obama-Biden administration had caused because of the more than 3 million immigrants that were deported under their watch. And so I think, yes, the majority of Latinos will vote for Joe Biden, but I think a lot of young Latinos in particular needed to hear that, right? And I was looking on Twitter, I was looking at my friends, a lot of Dreamer activists, and they'll tell you, we needed those words to heal. No, we're still healing, and we still carry that pain. And so a vote for him will end up being a vote of confidence. People are putting a lot of trust. People were betrayed, promises were made. And so, that I won't say that it's a game changer, but I think there's a lot of fear right now on both campaigns, right? We know that 4 years of Trump, a lot of people won't survive that, but I think they needed some form of inspiration and confidence and trust. And I think that apology, will go a long way.
I thought it was incredibly powerful, right? Especially because it was so direct and plain spoken.
Yes.
We made a mistake. We took too long in changing our policies and our direction. And you talked about how important hearing that was for young Latinx folks. We know that the Latinx community has become the nation's largest voting bloc. Do you see young Latinx folks in particular as the generation of change, especially in this election season?
Yeah, and that's what I find in the book. No, I think the biggest generational difference, and every chapter talks about that, is that every Latino family has a level of trauma in their story. No, there is some pain, and children and you know, kids grew up watching their parents have to assimilate, no, have to reduce their rights and live with the imposter syndrome. And so they grew up with that. And so what I see and what I found in the book and what I'm seeing right now in the polls is that a lot of young people are rejecting that. No, they're speaking up for their parents. They're sick of it. COVID-19 was the culmination of all of that, right? Where suddenly you have Latinos that look around you, you know, 37,000 Latinos are dead. The unemployment rate for Latinos was like 18% in May. And so maybe politics was not personal at some point. Now it is, no? And on top of that, it's like they're rejecting that. And so I do think, and we know, like, they are coming out. There's like more than 3 million Latinos that have already voted. That's unprecedented for early voting.
One of the things that I think about often when I think about folks of color in politics is just how reductive it can often be. So I had a conversation with some students from my fellowship at Harvard last night, and one of the other fellows said, you know, he's a Black man. He said, I'm looking forward to the day when I get ready for a debate and I don't anticipate the only questions about Black people having to do with violence, criminal justice, and police.
Of course.
Similarly, we often see in politics the conversation around Latinx folks is reduced only to immigration, right? How do you think about that reduction?
I mean, it's the same way, and I think the changes in those and I've been in those campaigns, I've been in those circles, and I think the second that they stop seeing Latinos as like the Latino vote, no, or the Latino strategy, and it's like it is a winning strategy, no, whether you're in the Midwest, in the South, wherever you are, like Latinos are part of the winning strategy, right? And if you just change that mentality, I think that is reflected in the way you talk about us, no? When you talk about the economy, you talk about us. When you talk about healthcare, you talk about us. When you talk about anything, you talk about us. And so I think it starts with an understanding that, like, it's not a sector. If you want to win, we have to be present in the entire conversation.
Yeah, we've got a comment from Sabrina talking about the fact that, as you were talking about earlier, the acknowledgement of the mistake around immigration gives space for voters to believe that the work has a chance of getting done after the election. The work doesn't stop on 11/3. I could not agree more. And speaking of, to your point about kind of remaking our understanding of the Latinx community, Latinx issues, let's talk about Latinx folks in the Midwest. You traveled coast to coast for this book, and you decided to make several stops in the Midwest, which a lot of folks it sounds counterintuitive because we don't necessarily think Midwest and Latinx folks. But you stopped by our beloved St. Louis, and you spent some time and tell this incredibly beautiful and moving story about a young dreamer who is competing in a drag show. We know we've got some pretty famous drag shows in St. Louis.
I didn't know that.
But yeah, it's like there's a whole culture. I mean, it's just this beautiful sense of expression. Obviously, you got to discover a lot of that. Tell us about that experience and kind of what you found and learned during your time in our beloved city.
Yeah, so the story begins with, so it's my friend Ado, no? He's a dreamer. And so one day I get a text and he says, you know, it really sucks because my dream is to compete in RuPaul's Drag Race, but I can't. And he was like, I can't do it because I'm undocumented, right? And like that, like he couldn't compete in that. And so he was looking online, and the one beauty pageant where he could compete is called Miss Gay America, which happens in St. Louis. And so that is the beginning of the journey. You know, you can't go to RuPaul's. And so Miss Gay America is where he steps in. And so Ilo's from Arizona, and, you know, his parents are undocumented. He's a dreamer. And so I followed him from Arizona to St. Louis. It was also my first time in St. Louis. And, you know, the circle in which Ilo was around was a circle of gay men, no, mostly. But just just in that, no, just in the biases that I have, that, you know, that gay men would be open to someone like Ado, no, that they are liberal and they're open, like just being in that space with him and seeing how other people were looking at him, and that already set the tone from the beginning, right? Because Ado was probably maybe one of the two brown folks in that space, but what Ado wanted to do in St. Louis was, yes, try and win the pageant. He didn't. He lost really bad, but he wanted to come out as, for the first time, in drag, and tell folks in that room that he was undocumented. And so for me, the moment was like staring at him in that stage, but then looking around me and seeing like eyeballs open, no, sort of like these like jaws drop. And I'm not even exaggerating. Like there was this moment, everyone was singing, and, you know, different contestants came. But then when Ado got on stage, it was like, I think for many, for the first time, they had seen, you know, in St. Louis, you are removed from the border narrative, and you are removed from the immigration narrative. And here was Ado, like telling them, I think out loud for the first time, who he was. And I think he didn't win, but I think people's perceptions changed, no? People saw someone that they hadn't in a long time. And so it was just a huge act of bravery. There was also kind of like messed up things where like people would joke around and be like, hey, ICE is in the building, right? And so again, again, this has nothing to do with St. Louis, but this is to say, like, in the most liberal spaces, no, things like this happen. Your biases get the best out of you. So, yeah.
I wanted to read a passage from that chapter that I just think is so powerful. You said, at a time when the country wanted Ado silenced, he was choosing to live as loudly as possible in every possible space he walked in. People like Ado were once meant to live in shadows and closets, a shadow that kept many from revealing their undocumented status, and a closet that hid their sexual orientation from their more conservative Latino community. But Ado chose to abide by none of these rules. And in drag, he saw not just a shiny crown, but an opportunity to make a political statement, an opportunity to disrupt. Disrupt your definition of what it means to be undocumented, your understanding of what a gay man should look like, your assumptions of what Latinos stand for, and your notions of what drag is meant to achieve. Drag shows are there not just to entertain, but mostly to challenge all biases, whether you're drunk at a drag brunch or not. I love that.
I mean, that's what he did. And you know, he's an organizer. When he's in Arizona right now, he's an organizer. Right now, he's getting the vote out. But he'll tell me, he's like, how will people pay more attention to me, in drag or like this? So he uses drag very intentionally, and it works.
It works. So beyond St. Louis, but still in the Midwest, what do you think is the biggest misconception that you found kind of in the Midwest about the Latinx community? How did you kind of break through that? How did the folks that you talked to break through those misconceptions?
First, I mean, just the one that we see in politics all the time. First, that like Latinos aren't in the Midwest, right? You rarely hear any of the candidates talk about or search for Latinos in these pockets. And that's the biggest misconception, right? If even if you look at the numbers from like 2000 to 2010, the population growth amongst Latinos was felt the most in the Midwest, actually, and in the South. No, your mind never takes you there. And so the way that I approached the Midwest was, you know, this is a region of the country that is meant to not feel ours. No, it is meant to make you feel like you're not really supposed to be there. And so I looked for the things that make Latinos feel like home. No, and that's sort of how I took my journey around the Midwest, right? So I went to Illinois, and I didn't even think about like the policies. No, I went there to search for food. No, who were the small businesses that were creating food, no, that were setting up their food stands. For years, they're the ones that have been creating this sort of like refuge for Latinos that have been going to Illinois for years. Then I went over to Minnesota, where my girlfriend Diara is from. No, she's Afro-Latina. And so there I started with art. No, how are Latinos in Minnesota inundating, you know, cities and the Twin Cities with art and the murals? And so I followed art there. Then I went over to Wisconsin. And news to me, Wisconsin has the largest Latino festival in the entire country, right? And so I searched for music. I found like young mariachi players. I found hip hop artists. I found Latinos that are playing electronic music. There's a massive, music industry led by Latinos. And in Iowa,
Wait, I'm sorry, Iowa?
No, then I went to Iowa. No. The music isn't Wisconsin.
No. But I'm just saying, you were like, I have to put Iowa on the list. Again, to the point about people not expecting presence. Iowa.
Yeah, because I had heard that in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, which I had never been to, there was a massive raid a couple of years ago. And so again, I was like, I didn't even know there was this massive raid. And so I went to this town, I went to Mount Pleasant, and I found this church that is, 50% white, 50% Latino, and it is through religion, in this conservative county that you actually find a lot of like unexpected unity, and I found it in a church. And then I went to another town in Iowa, in Liberty City, and it is completely bilingual. It is a town where most people will speak Spanish. And so again, instead of leading myself through intuition, it was all through things that felt like home. And that's how I started to break the stereotypes. How are Latinos making themselves feel at home? And that's why I call the chapter Home, right? Because in the most unexpected of places, Latinos make it feel like home.
I love that. So I want to switch gears a little bit. You mentioned Diarra, who is our connective tissue. We love Diarra. And the last time Diarra and I talked, we talked about AfroLatinx Identity a bit. And that's something that you explore I know Diarra's watching, by the way. Hi, sweetie.
I hope so.
But you talk about this in the book. You talk about Afro-Latinx identity. You talk about colorism. And I think in the public discourse, Afro-Latinx identity is something that is just beginning to be explored, both by Black folks, Latinx folks, Afro-Latinx folks. So tell us more about who you talked to in the book about this particular issue, and what were some of your takeaways from those conversations?
Yeah, and I mean, it even starts with Diarra, and when Diarra and I first started dating, we met in the Clinton campaign, and when I would go into the Latino circles, she would always say, like, I don't really feel accepted in the Latino circles, right? And so the conversation even started there. Like, why did we not look at Diarra as one of us? No, why didn't she feel comfortable enough to claim her Afro-Latinidad, no, to say that she was a proud Mexican? And that had to do with us, right? Because we were rejecting her in a way. And so the way that I thought about it, in exploring that part of the book, was thinking about where the erasure starts. No, and the erasure starts at the south of the border, right? There's at least 130 million Latin Americans of Afro descent. And so, I went to Mexico and I started having conversations there, and you start to understand, obviously, the erasure starts there. It wasn't until 2019 that Afro-Mexicans were included in the Constitution of Mexico. It wasn't until 2015 that Afro-Mexicans were even counted in the census, right? And so erasure starts there. And then I was like, all right, so what does that look like in the border, no? And so I spent some time with like undocumented Black immigrants. And there you understand that first you're invisible in that narrative. And then once you cross, you're navigating two systems. Now you're navigating and you're being criminalized in the immigration system and in the criminal justice system. All of a sudden, you're too Latino to be Black and too Black to be Latino. And then I was like, all right, so what does it look like then if you're just like an Afro-Latina that has papers, that has the privilege of having papers? Same thing, no? And what it means to be beautiful, something as simple as like feeling beautiful and feeling okay in your skin, you understand that, you live your life based on someone else's standards. And I felt it in some way simply because I was gay. So again, it was putting myself, what does it mean to be an Afro-Cuban? I grew up in Miami. How is it that I had never met Afro-Cubans in my childhood? And so I spent a lot of time with that. And then I said, all right, so within the country, what it means to be Afro-Latina in the East Coast suddenly means something different in the West Coast. And so I followed this amazing poet, D'Angeli, from the Bronx to LA. And how she claims her Afro-Latinidad proudly here in the Bronx, suddenly she has to hide it in LA, no? And so anyways, all this to say that I'm still learning and I'm still unpacking and I'm still understanding all of it. But at least I tried to get a glimpse, no, of what it means to navigate with these two identities.
I was thinking a lot while I was reading your book about some time I spent last year in Mexico, meeting for a storytelling journey and a story kind of collection journey, meeting with migrants, right, who were passing through. They were a lot of them had ridden on the beast, the train, where unfortunately a lot of people will travel on top and at great danger to themselves, but for necessary reasons. And along the way, I met a young Afro-Honduran woman. And even amongst this tiny enclave of migrants, she was the darkest skinned and found herself completely ostracized. And we had this whole conversation through a translator. And when she said to me, she was like, "You're the first Black person I've seen in a while and who's like actually talked to me about these kinds of things." And we communicate. I'm not going to say her name for obvious reasons, but we communicate through Facebook whenever she's got access. And this is a constant burden for her while she is literally fighting for her life. Right. Yeah. So we're putting stuff on top of people who are already trying to figure out their way through some of the most difficult circumstances that anybody could face. And when you say you're still learning, I think that in of itself is such a powerful statement because you are a white passing Latina, right? So when you're having these conversations, did anything surprise you, right? You talked about some of the things that you had never thought about or some of the people you realized you had never met. What was the most surprising for you, given your own identity?
It's all of it. No, to me, it was just, I felt it even just started with my own family, with I had gone to Cuba myself, and then suddenly I'm walking in Cuba. My mom is Cuban, my dad is Mexican, and I remember going to Cuba, going to Havana, and no one looked like us in Miami. Everyone, like people in Havana, were Black and they were brown in ways that I had never grown up with in Miami. And so even that for me was like, I remember going back to Miami, going back to my like bubble there, and I was like, how is it that in my entire life growing up in Miami, where the Cuban population is power, and where Cubans dominate Florida politics, how is it? How is it that I had never, that in the dinner table we never talked with Afro-Cubans? And so honestly, that was the first thing, just looking back at my childhood and understanding that I truly did live in a complete bubble. And so when I say that I'm still learning, it truly is like it's years. I'm more than 30, so it's years of unpacking that.
Yeah. So we have time for me to ask you just a couple more questions, but I want to make sure to leave time for our incredible audience to ask you questions. So if you are already thinking of questions, you're sitting on them, they're burning in your mind, go ahead and put them in the comments and we will make sure that we ask them of Pao. I think that there's already one in there, but please make sure to add them while I'm asking these last two. So first of all, you talk about in the book, as you kind of chronicle the term and the idea of Latinx, you talk about this rise in solidarity and kind of a collective sense of freedom that you feel like you've witnessed among Latinos that you feel like you hadn't seen before. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, to me, when I really, really saw it exposed was this summer. With George Floyd, when suddenly for the first time, when you look at the streets and suddenly you see that young Latinos are holding postcards that say, tu lucha es mi lucha. No, it wasn't Latinx for Black people. It wasn't us and them. It was your fight is my fight. No, and I think that is the first time where there is an awakening amongst us that like Afro-Latinos, there's 3 million Afro-Latinos in this country, right? That Black folks are part of our community. And I that's what I mean by solidarity, And I think Latinx forces you to see the country in a different way, to see your own in a different way. So I witnessed that this summer. And then even also, with a lot of the conversations that I had with Latinas, with older generations and younger generations, we were talking about a lot of conversations about, abuse and sexual assault and how do we normalize sexism. And in almost every conversation, young Latinas, would talk to me, and if their moms were around, they'd say, "Mom, mama, ven, no, come." And then you could see Latinas in the older generation sort of they didn't have words sometimes to talk about like sexism because a lot of there's a lot of taboos that we grew up with, but even that like pushing your mom into the conversation, pushing your grandmas and your abuelas into the conversation, helping them break their own taboos and stereotypes. talking about abortion in Texas. You know, conversations like that I witness all the time. So that's what I mean by solidarity.
That is incredibly powerful. I'd love to hear from you for my final question. What your most memorable moment, like what sticks out for you most from the book, from all of these coast to coast conversations?
I think for me, the person that always comes to mind and through it all is Carolina. Carolina is she's a transgender woman, and she's in Arizona, and through her, I sort of saw it this way. No, I think a lot of people, even now in COVID, no, we are able to push through, no, and we're able to sort of keep going amidst the hardest of things, because some of us have the luxury of sort of seeing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. No, there's something that makes us, that keeps us going. With Carolina, who fled Mexico because she was trans, and you know, who all of a sudden crossed the border, wanted to be in Arizona because she wanted to be an educator. Suddenly she couldn't get any jobs. Suddenly she ends up being in a detention center again. She ends up being assaulted. There is no light at the end of the tunnel for Carolina. No, none at all. But she keeps going, and yet she keeps on going. And you ask her, was this worth it for you? And she says yes, right? And so I think that the resiliency that I found in Carolina is one that I think we have a lot to learn from. No, what keeps her going? I think there's a lot of leadership to learn from her. There's a lot of like organizing to be learned from her. But that like force, I've never seen.
So incredible. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to pass it to Shane because I know that there are already some great questions in the comments.
And a reminder that you can also ask Brittany questions as well. So yes. I know that Brittany's work is incredible, and some people in the audience might have questions for Brittany as well. I want to start with one question that I have really been especially inspired by this conversation to ask, and it is about passing. And as a queer person, like when I stopped trying to pass as straight, to pass as the patriarchy, and to accept that I am not straight. I am not a masculine straight person. I have very feminine qualities, and it was so liberating when I stopped trying to pass. And I'm wondering if you experienced that also as a queer person, and if you saw that a lot on the road as well.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, you know, my dad's a newscaster in one of the Spanish language, you know, empires in this country. And that means for me that I grew up, you know, watching him alongside Latinas that looked very different than me, no? And I grew up in that environment where, like, in telenovelas, no, where like it was men and women. That was what love looked like. And so I felt like I had to pass a lot. In fact, to this day, I'll tell you that when I'm in Mexico, when I see my family in Mexico, when I see my family in you know, my Cuban family in Miami, I will not lie and tell you that I always feel like I can be 100%. And ever since 2016, and I'm not gonna say this word allowed me to liberate, but I do feel like when I say Latinx, and this maybe this is cheesy, but I feel like I don't have to give an explanation. You know what I'm saying? Like I feel like in that word, it captures me, and I don't need people to ask me like, does this mean you're this or that? Like I feel like that is who I am. If that makes any sense. So it has been liberating because I feel like I don't owe anyone an explanation.
Not owing people an explanation is absolutely a form of
I'm going to start with one of our top fans, Colette's question. Colette is also a good friend of mine and doing incredible work in St. Louis as a teacher. So Colette says, my mother-in-law is Mexican and she holds a lot of animosity towards Cubans because they were welcomed to America as refugees. She says, I do not have that animosity, by the way, but asks, what was it like growing up with in those two very different cultures?
You know, I think for me it was different because my grandfather is a Cuban exile. Like my mom and my grandfather and that part of the family, like they've always. I think the problem with the Cuban community is that there are a lot of Cubans that are able to forget that they too were once immigrants, right? And because of the journey of the Cuban journey in this country, right? This like easy pathway to citizenship automatically makes a lot of Cubans forget that they were refugees once, that they were political exiles once. And so I think that's a lot of the like tension that you see between a lot of communities in the Cubans, that they want to assimilate and like get as close as possible. In fact, DR told me the other day, like Cubans are the like white passing block of Florida. No, they move around the state like that, no? And the privilege for me is that my family never allowed that. No, my grandfather and my mom were always reminding me, like, this is where you come from. You know, the reason that you get to do all these things is because your grandfather was once put in prison, and like now he's here. So I fortunately, like, my immediate family was never able to forget the only reason we came to this country, right, which is because they had to migrate. But my parents never, the Mexicans and the Cubans, that love affair didn't work out. Obviously, my parents separated, but that's a whole other story. But the tension in migration, I didn't experience that.
Samantha's question is, how do you think the conversation within and about the Latinx community will look 5 years from now?
Question.
I mean, I think if you look at 2018, right, and you see who ran for office, and who's in Congress, and you may love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or you may not, but her voice is changing Congress, Suddenly you look at right now who's running, and we may have the first queer Latina ever. We may have the first Afro-Latina ever. We may have the first queer Afro-Latino, the first Latino Arab in Congress, the first Latino and Native American veteran. And so that is what Congress may look like, in a couple of months. And so I think that's where the future is. Now suddenly Congress and when people talk about us in those halls in Washington D.C. will start to sound very different. They will mention issues in very different ways. And so I just look at who is about to potentially represent us.
The next question is going to be from Chris, co-owner of Left Bank Books. Chris says, thank you both so much for this incredible conversation, inspiring and hopeful. I love and appreciate the natural intersectionality you embody in your work. For both of you, was this a conscious decision, an awareness that slowly dawned, or something that you have hammered out in discussion with other activists?
Brittany, you go first.
All right, if you want to, if you need to take a drink of water or something. I would say, frankly, that it was a bit of both. I feel really grateful to have been raised by two deeply intersectional people, even though that was people with a deeply intersectional orientation, I should say, even though that wasn't necessarily the language of the time. Both my parents are in ministry and are liberation theologians. So this idea that everybody deserves freedom and that justice is actually a divine mandate was really central to my upbringing and my development as an activist, my raising as a person. In some ways, it really clicked for me when I better had a grasp of how supremacy functions, because supremacy is made more successful when marginalized people remain in competition with one another. Mm-hmm. So when, Latinx folks and Latinos are in competition with Black people, and Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latino folks are completely erased, supremacy benefits from that. Mm-hmm. We're over here fighting over scraps instead of actually having and forcing systemic change. And so I think something clicked for me when I understood that was part of the game, and therefore moving in the opposite direction would be an essential part of freedom work. But some of it has been hammering it out with other people, because I can talk about operating in solidarity and sacrifice and rhetoric, but it looks very different realistically. As a Black person who was born in this country, I had a lot to learn about what it meant to be undocumented. I had a lot to learn to make sure that I was not unintentionally, for example, replicating and perpetuating this kind of division between dreamers and their parents, because that is a piece of rhetoric that is deeply damaging to freedom work and to communities. But a lot of people want to go with this idea of, well, they were brought here with, no choice of their own, and really and like, actually that is a problem. And I had somebody had to tell me, because that was not my experience, somebody to tell me this is the way you should talk about it. And so I'm not going to sit here and pretend I woke up one morning totally knowing all of these things. It was because people took the time to teach me. It's because I read, you know, Paola's work and have read this book. And so I think it is a bit of both. It is about feeding what may be a natural orientation, thankfully, because of my parents, it was for me. But it is also about never being above correction and opening yourself up to the education that you receive from the folks that you are supposed to be in solidarity with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with those principles, right? Of like what my dad taught me was you always question power. What my mom taught me is you always find the dignity in people. I do think that growing up, you know, I grew up between Madrid and Miami, but I think growing up in Miami kind of like messes your mind up a little bit because, you know, no, truly. Because, you know, at least 70% of the folks around you are Latino. Right. And so I think in Miami, it's so normalized to speak Spanish. It's so normalized to say that you're Latino, to say that you're an immigrant, that you don't say that. In fact, I don't ever remember saying that. And so I think it took leaving Miami. And that's one of the exercises I did in the book. I talked to a lot of people that I went to school. I was like, what happened when you guys left Miami? And everyone has this, all of us had this sort of realization that, like, as I said, Miami is a bubble, right? And so I think to me, that was the first step of understanding like who I was. But in order to understand that, I had to leave the Miami bubble. And then the same, no, it was meeting undocumented folks, and I learned the most from dreamers, no, the activism, the messaging, the being in your face, no, the pushing, and then from then it's been gradual, no, all the time, every year I'm learning, no, and I think it was the 2016 election where I truly, like, it dawned on me that, you know, why we hadn't. I don't even remember ever saying the word after Latino. I don't even remember ever using a lot of this vocabulary or thinking about these issues in this way. And so for me, it's been gradual.
Thank you both for those answers. The next question is from Reese, I believe, or if I'm mispronouncing, I do apologize. For Paola, I recently watched your panel with conservatives and liberal Latinx voters with Vice. I believe that took place pre-COVID. I was curious if you think any of these sentiment expressed there would differ now, and would you want to reconvene that group for an updated conversation?
I don't think it's different, right? And I think one of the things that we're learning is that, you know, the Latino Trump supporter that we saw in 2016 is pretty steady, right? It's not surprising. In fact, we shouldn't be at all surprised if he gains a little bit more, if suddenly that 30% becomes a 31%. And I think that's also part of understanding the journey and understanding the story, right? When you are taught to assimilate, and when you are told that you have to assimilate, you know, that white power is what you aim for, and that is the American dream. Some Latinos, as I said before, do want to forget where they come from. No, they don't want to be otherized. And so in Donald Trump, and some people are bought by that illusion, right? They want to be close to that as possible. And they can forget, no, the images that we saw yesterday of the children being separated. Some people see that and they don't want that, no, because they don't want to be reminded that someone at some point in their families had to go through that drive, no? And so unfortunately, I would love to talk to them again. I'm in touch with some of them, but there's no change right now.
Callie says, I couldn't imagine what it was like to pare down stories because of editing, because I'm certain that you, like, some of the sections are so impacting, but also kind of brief. So Callie's asking, what was that process like?
I mean, it's my first book, so I'm learning a lot. It was, you know, but the way that I did every chapter, yes, the book was a lot longer, like a lot longer. But the way I did everything was I had like 9 months to write this, and so, which is, I guess, not that long. I learned, and so I would
not. I've been working on this freaking book for 2 years. 9 months is not a long time.
No, I know, but I was It was honestly, it was crazy. And so that's one of the things that I if I ever were to write another book, I need to take more time. But for me, it was really important for it to come out before the election, right? So all this to say, I would be in New York and I would go, transcribe all these interviews, embed with them, come back to New York, write a chapter, And so I did that 12 times, 12 different trips. And yeah, what you see is probably like 10% of these conversations, right? For me, all it was, I was there to listen. And so the writing tactic for me it's writing, but I also wanted to visualize everything in the writing. And the real book, I think, would have been like 400 pages. No one wants to read 400 pages. But that was really hard to understand. Like, what do you cut? What's repetitive? But then is being repetitive good? Is that exactly what I want? Do I want to say this as many times as possible? But yeah, it wasn't. It was like this.
And from my reading, there are also a lot of moments where you can take like a little section and then like look up on YouTube to watch videos of the drag performers and to like find out more about some of these people that are very in the public sphere. So, I mean, obviously there are a lot of people that aren't easily Googleable. But you can look up and find out more information and find out more experiences. And so I was definitely doing a lot of other searching while I was reading it. So it's like there's a lot that you can do as a reader to further the experience as well. But I thought it was like incredible to just sit down and experience and read. And I mean, it is, I think, a very wonderful length of like getting to experience so many lives in such a compact book. So
thank you. I mean, the truth is you could write a whole book out of all of these people, and so that's it. But to me, the way that I see it is as long as it starts conversations as long as it makes people feel uncomfortable, which is good, I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Lucia asks, what do you think is keeping the Latinx community from organizing in the ways that other communities have?
I mean, I think they are. I think right now I will say with confidence that, I mean, they are organizing, right? I think, in fact, a lot of the turnout that you're seeing, I wouldn't say is necessarily because of the campaigns. It is because of the Latino organizers. It's because of the dreamers. It's because of the activists that have been there for years, right? I hate when they say it's like the sleeping giant, because that entails that, we're lazy or that we're just not showing up. A lot of it is, again, because they knock on our doors like 3 months before. You see in the headlines 4 months before the Latino vote. And so it takes more for people to show up. But I will say the organizing is happening, and Latinos will turn out. I think in the last 4 years, it truly is like a matter of, of survival for a lot of folks. And so that number one. And number two, I think there's a lot of discussions that we never have had as a community. There's a lot of biases that we have. There's a lot of internal division amongst us. And I think we're just starting to have those conversations right now.
And you mentioned in the book that there's like a very small population in comparison, a small percentage of Latinx in St. Louis. So I think if Lucia is living here in St. Louis, it might not be as evident, but it is happening.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it can happen more, and St. Louis is a great place for it to happen, as a city just full of activists. So.
Yep.
Sabrina's question is, you just touched on it. This is from, I believe maybe from Chris's question. My question is, how did you break through some of the intergenerational differences in your interviews? How did you tailor or redirect questions if the concepts weren't resonating?
I mean, even with I'll take my grandfather as an example. When I first explained the word Latinx, it's word to explain. It's weird and complicated to explain a word without showing faces and stories. So a lot of it was having him understand who I was talking about. And when you break it down, instead of in numbers and real people and real stories, he understood that he himself knew a lot of these people, that his own granddaughter and was feeling a certain way for a reason. And so to me, it was simply like putting real faces to the numbers and to the stories and to the X. I think the X really like weirds out a lot of people. I think even just in Florida, they'll be like, oh no, that's a communist thing. No, that's for the liberals, right? But when you start explaining who you're talking about, when you start going back to like that original empathy that I think, is the foundation of a lot of immigrant families, and people get it. No, so it was just making sure that it was just like real stories.
And a couple of comments for you, Brittany. Sabrina is saying, thank you for all your work. Really looking forward to Undistracted.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And
Me
Anna
too.
says, I'm so thankful to you for using your platform to uplift our voices all the time.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
So I think we might be out of questions. There were a lot, but I think I got them all.
Powered through them.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you, honestly, so much to you, Brittany, and to you, Shane, and to Left Bank. Like this, I'm very, very grateful, and thank you for supporting the book. I hope people support you, and just it's an important conversation to have, and not a lot of people are doing this, and so I'm just thank you so much.
No, thank you. Are you kidding me? This was a treat for my Friday night, truly. So thank you for having me be able.
You did the hard work of traveling all over the country and interviewing people. I just got to sit down and read it.
No.
Yeah. All right. I want to thank both of you so much for doing this event, for being here, for writing the book, for doing the work that you're doing, for doing the activism, the education that you do. And I thank you on behalf of Left Bank Books, on behalf, Chris says, the honor is all ours. Thank you both so very much for your work. And that's from Chris, the co-owner of Left Bank Books. So thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks, Pao, for giving us such good stuff to think through.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
You too.
And as a reminder, we do have signed copies of the book available at left-bank.com. I have put a link in the comments, and I will go ahead and do that again. And I hope everyone watching at home has a fantastic rest of your night, a wonderful evening and weekend. So
Thanks.
have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.